I grew up in the rural, segregated South. Seven of us lived in a four-room house. We had no running water. We had no air conditioning, and the wood-burning cooking stove also served as a heating source for the house. The work day for us was a 6 to 6. So I would get up at 6 a.m. in the morning, do my chores. We would go to the field shortly thereafter, and we would stay in the field picking cotton or chopping cotton, depending on what time of the year it was, until 6 in the afternoon. We were sharecroppers. We stayed on a white family's farm in the house that I described. In exchange for that, we had to harvest the crop, either picking cotton during picking season or chopping cotton during chopping season. And so growing up was a very challenging experience for me as a child, primarily because as I looked across the road and I would see the white kids on the farm playing or going to camps while I was in the field working on behalf of that family. So it did influence me as a kid. But I have to say it influenced me in a positive way because there are things I knew I did not want my children to experience. So I did what I had to do to make sure that I changed that paradigm. My grandmother was the monarch of our family. Everything revolved around my grandmother, even up to the day she died. In fact, if she was still living, she would be 107. Her birthday would have been last month. So everything revolved around her. Most of my values came from my experiences with her, either directly or observing her from a distance. But there's no question, she had influence on me. She was the monarch of the family. And the things that I hope I am or became in life came as a result of her influence on me.
You know, one of the things that I've seen as a trend when I've interviewed people successful as yourself is this twofold. One, coming from a big family and sharing resources in their youth, and then also a strong maternal presence. Typically, the grandmother more so than the mother. I've heard. What do you think it is about those two situations that ultimately lead to success?
Well, I mean, there's no question. If you think about grandmothers in the black family, especially, their influence is powerful. In my case, my grandmother was a very religious woman. She was very rooted in the Bible. She believed, and so even when things were not going well for us, she saw that as something that was temporary. Because if we had faith and if we stayed the course, something good would come out on the other end. And so for me, even though I didn't have the faith that she had, the fact that she had it, and in most cases, she was proven to be right, that if we kind of stayed the course, things would work out on the other end. So that influence carried on through my life. But I also noticed that she had influence on others in the family as well. Maybe not to the extent that she had on me, because I truly drank the grandmother Kool-Aid. And so even when I was out doing things that I knew were wrong, and she may have been hundreds of miles away, I always kind of thought that she might be looking and seeing what I was doing. So yeah, that maternal influence is powerful and influential, and it doesn't go away. I mean, it doesn't matter how old you are or how old you get to be. You always think about that influence that person had on you, and it also impacts how you try to raise your own children. Because if it worked for me, it should work for my children as well.
And I mentioned already that you're a fairly young guy, and you had this extremely difficult and challenging experience in your youth. And you mentioned the motivation of seeing your white counterparts not having to go through the same challenges as leading you to greener pastures, to say. But what there's one thing to have that motivation,
Mhm.
but there's another thing to do it. there's another thing to get out of that situation.
Hmm.
What do you attribute, and how did you get um, from that sharecropping situation into your next phase of life?
Well, I think faith was one, and again, that faith was driven by the observation of the faith that my grandmother had. Even in adversity, she would say, things are going to be better. But she didn't just say things were going to be better. She kind of made decisions that drove things to become better. And so one of the things I learned, I think, early on was I had to take charge of my life if I wanted the circumstances to be different. I just couldn't sit back and rely on others to do things for me that I could do for myself. So as I observed the white kids, the one thing that I knew was different was the fact that they were going to school during times where we were not in school. And so they were learning some things that I assume were putting them ahead of me. And so one of the things that I tucked in the back of my mind is I now have to work twice as hard in terms of education to catch up with them. And so as I observed, I decided college, well, I didn't decide, my grandmother decided college was something that was in all of our future. And so, but for me, it wasn't just going to college. It was going and knowing that I was behind the eight ball. I did not know what other children knew because I didn't have the prior experiences to prepare me for that. So when I hit undergrad school, I knew I had to run faster than anyone else to catch up and just to be at a break even. And I did that. And I had no problem with that because there was a goal I was trying to achieve. But I also had people pour into my life when I was in college to help me get to that next step. They didn't have to do that. I had a professor from Pakistan who forced me to apply for an internship with the U.S. State Department. And I said no repeatedly. He said, why? And I said, well, that's for city boys and white boys and girls, not for me. And he said, but you have the same credentials that they would have, so you could do it. So I said no. One day I went to class. He asked the class to dismiss themselves and asked me to stay. I stayed. He went in his desk, put a pen and a file on top, and he said, I fill out the application for you. I just need you to sign it. And to get him off my case, I signed it. I ended up doing an internship with the U.S. State Department. I went to West Africa. And that experience exposed me as a little country boy from Jackson, Tennessee, to what the world really had to offer. And I knew then I could never go back to my hometown. And I don't mean physically, but I mean the things that I did and experienced there would never be anymore in my world because I had seen what the true global world looked like. And I actually wanted a piece of that. So when I came back from West Africa as part of the internship, I went to Ohio State to go to graduate school. And why did I do that? I was the only person in my family who had gone outside of the U.S., except those who might have gone to military. But I was also the only one who had pursued a master's degree. And so I knew that it was my job to set an example for the rest of the family. And so just pursuing my graduate degree at Ohio State was part of that path. And it kind of worked out for me.
That's a fascinating story, the impact that people can have on your life. And you went to an HBCU. What do you think is the critical transformation process, or how is it that HBCUs are able to shape young people of color differently?
Well, I think one of the things is they nurture their students. They will do things for a student that the non-HBCUs just don't do because it's not part of the curriculum. So the expectation is that when you come to a college or university, you're ready to do what is required at that level. At HBCUs, they take a step back and say, maybe you're not. Maybe you are a Jesse Tyson who did not have the experiences prior to coming here to totally prepare you to be here. And so they would step back and pour more into me to get me ready, to get me up to speed than I would experience anywhere else. So I think the first difference between the HBCUs and others is the fact that they do nurture their students. The other is my professors and I had personal relationships. My math professor actually turned out to be one of my mentors, who kind of followed my career years after I was outside of undergrad. And so just knowing that he had poured into my life and knowing that he was watching what I became just gave me the extra motivation to do what I ultimately think I did. You don't get that in the larger university. So it's really, for me, it's the nurturing, first of all. And in some cases, the opportunity to go to college because you didn't have any money. I had no money when I enrolled in Lane College. In fact, I remember the registrar asked me why was I standing in line if I didn't have any money? Why did I even come? And I explained to her that I came to get an education. She said, that's fine, but my job is to collect money. And but I said, but I don't have any. But we worked it out. But those experiences you don't get at the non-HBCUs. And I understand why you don't, but I also understand the value and the need for us to continue to pour into the HBCU community to make sure those institutions remain. Because even though those were different times back then, the need is just as great today as it was when I was a student.
Definitely. And, you attending the Ohio State University would have been enough to get you on this podcast by itself. But talk to me about what led you to Ohio State.
Well, first of all, thanks for putting the right word, "the," in front of Ohio State. What led me there? When I was in Dakar, Senegal, as part of the internship with the State Department, my world started to change. I started to form what I call a worldview of things versus a small town view of things. And so I knew coming back to Jackson was not what I wanted to do. So I had to figure out, well, what's next? And what's next was to figure out how to better prepare myself for a corporate career. And the conventional wisdom was I needed to have a graduate degree. And since I wanted to go into business, I needed to have an MBA. So I pursued where could I go out to get an MBA. First of all, I didn't have any money. Right. And so I stepped out, and it was interesting because the internship with the State Department, they actually offered me an internship to get a graduate degree. It required that I commit to a certain number of years with the federal government in order for them to do that. And at that age, I wasn't ready to make that kind of commitment. It was like a 7 or 8 year commitment, and that at that point in my life seemed like a lifetime. And so I turned down their internship. And so I went out on my own to pursue where did I want to go to grad school. And I ended up accepted to Ohio State, and I think Penn State made me an offer as well. And I never heard of Happy Valley, so I said, I'm not going to Penn State. My father's mother, my grandmother, lived in Columbus, Ohio. I did not know her growing up. And so this was an opportunity for me to connect with her. And Ohio State made me a generous offer, a fellowship, full ride. And so I ended up going to Ohio State partly because of my grandmother and the opportunity for me to really connect with her. And as a side benefit, as it turned out, my two grandmothers went to high school together, and they were friends. I didn't know that until I went to Ohio State.
You mentioned that you turned down that internship offer. And one time I was listening to Ken Chenault in a rather close luncheon environment, and he was talking about how he became CEO at American Express and how he was on this fast track. And then he hit this spot where they offered him a job that he wasn't interested in, so he said no. And then they offered him another job that he wasn't interested in, so he said no. And then the third time he said no. And then they stopped offering him jobs. And he wondered, did he mess up by saying no to stuff that he wasn't interested in?
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, obviously, he became CEO. But talk to me about the importance of no being just as important as yes.
Yeah, I think you have to be true to who you are and who you're trying to become. And I suspect in Ken's case, he had a plan for his life and his career, and those roles didn't fit that plan. And if you're truly confident in who you are, and you truly believe you are prepared to get to the next level, saying no is fine. Because if you say yes to the wrong job or the wrong position, it could sideline you or get you off track or where you were trying to go. And so I do believe it's important that you have to stay true to your game plan. And you truly do have to have a game plan. Otherwise, you'll just be sitting around accepting what others have to offer to you instead of you being on the aggressive end, making things happen. So I applaud Ken's a desire and his faith in himself to say no, because it doesn't get me where I'm trying to get to. Too often, we don't do that. If that job looks attractive on the surface, too often we'll jump at it. Does it fit the plan? Maybe not. Does it pay me more money? Yes, it does. And so we give up the long-range plan to satisfy a short-term financial need, or actually a financial desire, because it's not a need at that point. But in Ken's case, Ken had a plan. Somewhere he had mapped out the career path that he wanted for himself, and he had committed himself to that career path, and this job apparently didn't get him there. And I applaud him for not getting sidetracked or detouring off of his plan.
So you're at The Ohio State University now, and I've heard you talk about an individual who is extremely influential in your life, kind of a larger than life character up there, that also I think served as a mentor or whatnot. Tell me a little bit about him.
Yeah, Dr. Hale, Frank Hale. When I was at Lane College, my undergrad school, and as I went into the internship, one of the things that, as I was pursuing graduate opportunities, I would read a lot about what major universities were doing to attract Black students. Keep in mind, this was a time where not many Black students were pursuing higher ed beyond undergrad. Dr. Hale had decided that because he knew the HBCU community, he convinced Ohio State to give him budget money to go out and attract Black students at HBCUs to come to Ohio State to pursue graduate studies. And so he reached out into Lane College, where I went to undergrad, and others, and basically said to those institutions, give me your top one or two brightest and best, and I guarantee you I will send them back out to society on the post a degree from Ohio State, and all of us, including the country, would be better off for it. And so I went up to Ohio State as part of his program. They took me around campus for a weekend. I liked what I saw. It's kind of hard not to when Ohio State was bigger than my hometown. So I kind of drank the Kool-Aid early, and so Dr. Hale provided the opportunity for me to go, and it didn't cost me any money the 2 years I was there. Got to know him personally, and as a result of that, I noticed that he had a philosophy that was very similar to my grandmother's, and it was really that life should be lived in three stages. There's a learning stage, there's an earning stage, and then there's a returning stage. And so the learning stage was obviously getting yourself prepared through high school, undergrad, internships, and graduate studies. The earning phase is if you did the learning phase right, It prepared you to have robust earnings over the course of your career. Then there was the return phase, which basically says to whom much is given, much is required. And so it's time to kind of reach back and give to those coming behind you to make sure they had the same opportunities that I had. Those three phases, as I learned over the course of my life, they're not distinct phases where you do one, then you move to two, then you move to three. There's overlap. And I would venture to say at this point in my life, I'm still in the learning phase a little bit. I probably earn most of what I'm going to earn. And so I'm focused more now on the return.
I like that. Learning, earning, and returning. I've definitely stolen several of your sayings over the years, so I'm going to add that into the repertoire, and I'll send you a royalty check later.
Thank you.
So you are at the Ohio State. You went on a free ride, earned, and now it's time to enter corporate America, which is where you've already told me so many remarkable things, but I think the next phase of your life even gets more remarkable. Tell me about where you went after the Ohio State and how'd you get there?
Okay. Well, I almost didn't, when I was at Ohio State and the corporations would come on campus to recruit. The two companies that I really, really pursued was Exxon and Procter & Gamble. And I really, really liked the people at P&G when I went on the campus visit, the plant visit, and they were pretty cool. I mean, at the end of the interview, there were a set of keys laying in the middle of the table, and the guy said, "Those are the keys to your company car," which meant they were making me an offer on the spot. I ended up turning that offer down, primarily because I had kind of gotten fixated on. I wanted to work in an industry that I knew was going to have global implications in terms of how the world was going to move forward. And the energy industry was an industry that I was quite intrigued with. So I accepted the Exxon offer, which actually was less than the P&G offer. And so they offered me a job, and they also offered my roommate. They made an offer to him, and they told both of us not to talk about the salary offer. And as it turned out, we did talk about it. And they offered him $300 more than they offered me, and I was really upset about that. But I never told anybody. But it all worked out in the end. But so I leave Ohio State, and I start working for Exxon, and I worked predominantly. The first half of my career was in the U.S. The second half was all international. The first half was mostly marketing. Second half was mostly operational. But in that second half, in the first half, it was really about positioning what I really wanted to do as I saw myself getting very mature into my career. In most of the assignments that I was offered were assignments that were preparing me for the next opportunity, and I accepted those. I remember as a marketer, I remember the first non-marketing job that I was offered. It was a great opportunity. No one other than engineers had been in that role. And there was some risk associated with a non-technical person going into that job, but I felt that I was prepared, I was ready, and if I didn't make that move now, it was never likely going to happen for me in terms of the broader career. And so I said yes, and it worked out well, and it actually prepared me for more senior roles in the U.S. And ultimately got an opportunity to go outside of the Exxon U.S. business and go into the Exxon international world. And in the international world is really where my career just blossomed because everything I did had global implication, not just U.S. implications.
So once again, an example of saying no to an opportunity at Procter & Gamble. And I did my inroads internship at Procter and Gamble. So one, I'm amazed that they offered more money than Excise. But P&G is an impressive organization in and of itself. But you had the wherewithal to understand that the global implication and direction of the energy business is where you wanted to be, and you clearly made the right choice. Before we dive into the aspect of the global implication, because many of the stories I've heard you tell, I was amazed at the global footprint of Exxon and the opportunities it afforded you. But before we get into that, what off the bat challenges did you have entering into this corporate environment that you previously really hadn't been in, as a black man coming from Jackson, Tennessee, and what have you?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge was understanding what was at stake, and early on what the requirements were or expectations were of me. Keep in mind that I didn't have anybody in my household, be it immediate or extended, that I could have dinner conversations with about the Wall Street Journal. I knew just from some of my conversations at Ohio State with some of the fellow students that, at the dinner table, some of the students had to talk about an article that they read in the Wall Street. They may have to have talked about, a specific company in terms of what the stock open and close was and what some of the reasons were. I didn't have any of that. And so I couldn't intelligently have conversations with my peers about things because I just didn't have that exposure. So I think the biggest personal challenge for me was, how do I sit around the table and have conversations with these folks, knowing that I just didn't have the same experience that they had. And so that was kind of a personal insecurity that I had to find a way to overcome. The second was, when there was time where I needed advice, I didn't have anyone in my family I could go to and say, listen, this is something that's come up at work. I need some help kind of thinking through what my reaction should be and how I should pursue the particular issue. I didn't have that. So my network had to be developed quickly. And because I didn't have a natural family or extended family network to help me navigate some of that. The other issue that I had was early in my career. I had one of my peers use the N-word, and we were at a cocktail function. I wasn't supposed to have heard it because it wasn't a conversation that I was directly involved in, but I did hear it. And so I am trying to figure out in my head how I should react to this. And so things were going 100 miles an hour in my head because I had been with the company about a year, and all I could do is just hear my grandmother, because I kind of want to go take the guy out, and all I could hear is her saying, please don't, please don't. So the guy he was talking to said, don't talk so loud, Jesse may hear you. And because I was the only black person on our team. And so the guy said, well, Jesse may hear what? No, and I said, not the guy, I said, well, Jesse may hear what? And he said, well, nothing, he had too much to drink. Well, I heard him. And so we were in Cincinnati, Ohio, at a restaurant called La Maison. It was a 5-star restaurant. I think we were on the 3rd floor. And so I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to react to this. And so in the end, I didn't say anything. And so you fast forward 12 years later. The guy who said it was my boss's peer. 12 years later, I get promoted to a job, and he reported to a guy who reported to a guy who reported to me in my new role. And so I went down to his office on day one and sat down with him and had a chat with him, asked about how his wife was doing, how the boys were doing, etc. And he said they were fine. And I said, I hear you're doing a great job. You enjoy your job? He said, yes, yes. And so everything was fine. The next day he came to my office and asked if I would support a transfer. And I said, well, why? I thought you enjoyed your job. He said, yeah, I do. But I just think it's time for a change. And so we talked. I said, well, come on, tell me why. And so he sat back and he said, well, you remember, I said, that night in Cincinnati at La Maison? He said, yeah, you hurt me, didn't you? I said, yeah, I did. And I said, so is that why you want to transfer? And he said, well, yeah. I said, why do I need to be vindictive? I said, looking at the org chart, I've done okay, relative to where you are. So I don't need to do anything. He said, yeah, but I can't take the chance. So anyway, we ended up, he got transferred and everything worked out okay. But early on, I mean, it was a sign of the times. That was probably not uncommon, especially in a sales organization, especially if, when we would go out. And oftentimes, at the end of the day, there was alcohol being served. And so people would tend to be a little bit loose lipped at times. But there were some things early on. And I would say those kind of things, though, while they affected me, the impact was minor because I was kind of prepared for that. Later in my career, though, there was something that happened that I wasn't totally prepared for. And that was, I really had worked hard to get prepared to go into an international job where I was physically outside of the U.S. I was being groomed for a job in Singapore. And I knew that. I also knew that everybody except one person had signed off. And as it turned out, that one person didn't sign, and that was my boss. And I really had to struggle to figure out, how to move on, and not, let this get in the way of other things. In fact, to this day, he still doesn't know. I know that he was the guy who said no. So that was a major setback for me, because it truly was the job that I knew was going to change a whole lot of things for my career. As it turned out, I stayed the course. We ended up doing a merger, we being Exxon and Mobil, in 2000. And as a result of that, I had an opportunity to prove myself again to a different set of senior players. And as a result of that, I ended up taking the job in Miami as a regional director running the Latin America business for a few years. And then after that, I went to Brussels, Belgium to run a global aviation business as the global aviation director. And so there were things that had happened that had I reacted differently, may not would have happened the way I would have wanted them to happen. But I had a couple of people, and I didn't talk about one guy who, he was the only black person, period, that I worked for in my 35 years with ExxonMobil. A guy named John Holmes. And John was a Michigan PhD, so I don't know why we were friends, since he went to the wrong school. He was a White House fellow. He's one of the brightest people I've ever met. And John was a few years ahead of me, and so John was very, very secure in who he was. He was not intimidated by anybody, and so he took me under his wings, and he said, "I'm going to show you everything you need to know to be competitive in the international space." And so he and I, traveled the world, exposing me to the things that I needed. But John also was the guy that I would go to when things weren't going right for me, and he would say, "Well, this is how I would act or react, and this is how I wouldn't act or react." And I've trusted his opinion, his judgments, and his values And our relationship grew to be as close as if he was a blood brother. And he passed away shortly after he retired, but he provided some guidance for me, especially in the international world that I needed, because I didn't know that space. Um, but what I did know is when I would go outside of the U.S., people would listen to what I had to say based on what I was delivering in terms of the business. They didn't see me as a black guy. They just saw me as an American. If they didn't like me, they didn't like me because I was an American, not because I was a black American. And so the thing about the international world that I really, really enjoyed in my career was the opportunity to be me and to do what I felt was the right thing for the business and not feel that I had this extra hurdle of being black in that part of the world.
So Jesse, you just unpacked like 700 things that I want to touch on. Um, One, that was a fascinating story about your colleague that used the N word. That seemed like the ultimate revenge, although I know you weren't seeking that per se.
Correct.
That is truly what kind of comes around type of situation. You mentioned sign of the times in relation to that story. Talk to me about the sign of the times in terms of that period of opportunity for black people in corporate America, because as it seems to me, there were some opportunities afforded, be it affirmative action or other opportunities where black people were really getting chances that they may not be getting now. Do you think that's the case? And how do you think that did or did not influence what happened in your career?
Well, I think there was a time where people would recruit blacks in order to say they had blacks on their rolls. I don't think there was as much attention paid to the quality component as it is today. Um, I remember there was a time when we corporate America would hire blacks into their organizations. They would do fine for a couple of assignments, and then all of a sudden you start to see a gap appear between themselves and their white counterparts who were hired basically around the same time they were. And so as we start to dig into that, you start to hear things like, well, but they're not as analytical. And so we said, okay, let's talk about that. And so there seemed to have been a move afoot to close this perceived analytical gap. And after that was done, then all of a sudden you start hearing this thing, but do they have the leadership skills to be competitive? Well, don't know why you say that or why you would ask that question, but then there seems to have been a way to kind of close that perceived leadership gap. Then as we morphed into a global economy, you started to hear things like, but can they be competitive in the global workspace? And so it seemed like there was a period of time where every so often something would come up that was an inhibitor to black progress. From the analytics to the leadership to the global competitiveness. But in my experience, I can't tell you that I know many people who were given the opportunity to compete in the global workspace, who were people of color, who didn't bring the best of themselves and demonstrate that they can be as competitive as anyone else. Primarily because in the global workspace, other than when you're in the US, you didn't have that burden of being black on your shoulder, because people look at you and say, well, what are you bringing to help my business improve? they weren't carrying this baggage around that we carry around in the United States. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't have issues around race or class or other issues, but this particular one was one that we had been saddled with in this country for years that you just didn't have to worry about. Now, from a personal standpoint, I think most of us who had the opportunity to run a global business will tell you we carried the weight because we put that weight on our own shoulder. I knew when I stepped outside of the U.S., I knew I was carrying, Black America with me. I knew that there were times when people would look at me and would draw some conclusions about the entire race because of my actions or lack thereof. So did I have a personal sensitivity there? Yes, I did. I didn't feel though that others were putting unnecessary hurdles in front of me that I oftentimes had to deal with when I was in the United States.
And you mentioned John playing this very critical and important mentorship slash sponsorship role in your life. Talk to me about the importance of that type of outreach in corporate America leading to success.
Well, if you think back, Troy, there was a time where some companies had what they call mandatory mentoring programs. And in my experience, those programs didn't work very well. They were popular for a while, but they didn't work well because you can't legislate relationships. You can't pair you and me together and force us to be who we need to be as a mentor-mentee. The mentor-mentee relationships that were effective were those that were grown organically, where one of the two parties sought the other informally, and then they agreed to be a mentee or a mentor. And so I did see those relationships work well. But the other ones, I really just thought they just started off on a premise that were not good for success because it was you were trying to force things to happen that just weren't naturally there. And I think the thing that once we saw some of the informal mentoring relationships develop, others started to themselves pursue relationships in terms of there's some things I know I need, so let me partner with someone who I think might be able to help me. Keep in mind, though, there was a difference between mentoring relationships and sponsor relationships. Sponsorships came few and far between. And if you had someone who had decided to be your sponsor, then you had done something right. Because that person has seen something in you that they might think their organizational structure may miss if they don't intervene in your life and career and help you get over some of those hurdles. And so my experience has been, whether it was for me personally or observing others, sponsoring relationships really, really helped to move careers forward that mentoring relationships just didn't have a chance to do.
And one more thing I want to touch on before we dive into the global side of your Exxon experience is, I've heard you say that people in general, but you were referring to Black employees were hired to take the 3-point shot, but were taking layups instead. Expand on that and tell me what you mean.
Well, it's the easiest thing in the world to do is to do the easy stuff. And if you do the easy stuff, or if you take the easy assignments, the ones that are not going to stretch you very much, that in my mind is the equivalent of a layup. And you can probably hit 9 out of 9 layups, and you'll be shooting 1,000. All right. But is it going to get you where you want to get to? Versus, all right, I'm going to take a 3. I think I'm ready. I've prepared for it. I practice for it. The opportunity is here. In many cases, I'm wide open. And so I'm going to take the shot. And if I take the shot, many times I'll make that shot. And if I don't, it doesn't mean the game's over. It just means I missed that shot, and there'll be other shots. But I've seen too often where people are afraid to take the shot because they want to stay in this safe zone. And it's okay to stay in a safe zone, but understand the limits you put on yourself when you decide I'm just going to stay in that safe zone. I always took the position that if you're going to play for all the marbles. Anybody can shoot the layup, or just sit on the sidelines and let your teammate take the shot. But what does that do for you? What does that do for your legacy? What does that do for you in terms of your offsprings if you don't try to position yourself to get to the next level? Because much of what my children do today is a result of what they saw me do or observed in terms of my career. And so had I just kept shooting layups, undoubtedly my children would be still shooting layups today. Whereas they don't. I mean, in fact, sometimes I'll tell them shoot a layup and still taking the three, you know. And so as my youngest daughter, I said, why are you always taking the three? She said, because there's no four. And so, but no, it's all about taking risk, but calculated risk. If you are prepared and you think you're ready, why did you go through the preparation if you're not willing to step out and make the big move?
And so you mentioned your children, and I know that, having the career that you've had, some sacrifices have to get made in order to move up the corporate ladder. Talk to me about what's happening in your personal life, relationship-wise, how that influenced the decisions you did or did not make, and, would you do anything differently?
Yeah. I spent most of my early to mid career in Houston. And first of all, I don't think we talked about it, but I worked my entire career with ExxonMobil. So it's kind of a dinosaur model. We're 35 years with the same company. And most of those were in Texas, where in Houston, where most of us would say is a fairly easy place to live. I got to a point where I felt my children were growing up too soft. And things came easy for them. If I said no, my mother-in-law would say yes, or their aunts would say yes. And so I decided one day, as I was looking at my own personal career pursuits, that New Jersey would be a great little testing ground for them. So we ended up moving to New Jersey. Now they went kicking and screaming. And I ended up having to commit to take them to a different continent every year if they went without a lot of drama. And so they bought into that. Now, the deal I thought I had cut with Exxon at the time was I was only going to be there 2 years, and it turns out it was 5 years. And so it cost me a little bit, but they ended up getting some exposure that they would not have gotten otherwise. And so there are family impacts to every decision you make from a career standpoint. I had the fortune of having a wife who had kind of drank my Kool-Aid, and so she was more than willing to follow my lead. And so she gave her banking career when we moved to New Jersey from Houston, and focused more on the children because they were at that point where they needed more guidance than they may have otherwise in their younger years. And so I would say to anyone, don't underestimate the impact that career decisions, be they you relocated or be that you move into an area that's going to require you to put in longer hours, because it does have family implications. And you need to understand the trade-offs. And in my case, my family, my wife particularly, was supportive of what I was trying to do. And the children, I sat down with them. I said, one of the things that my grandmother told me that she said, only three things that she expected out of me. One, she expected me to be a good person. The other one she expected of me was to be respectful. And the third one was to keep childhood drama to a minimum. And I added the one fourth one that she never said, but she always required, and that is don't embarrass the family when you're out in public. I focus a lot on the keeping the drama to a minimum with my kids because sometimes kids can just be dramatic just for the sake of being dramatic. But I did accept the fact that I had changed their whole world when we moved from Texas to New Jersey, and I really changed their whole world when we decided to move to Belgium. I didn't take that lightly. So we sat and talked about it, and we talked about the long-term implications, as well as the short-term sacrifices that came with that. But I was blessed to have a family that supported my vision, and I think they supported the vision primarily because they knew my grandmother's story, and they knew this was just a chapter. And beyond that, they also knew that there was a chapter that they're going to have to write because the story doesn't end with my life and my career.
And so you move the family to Belgium, where you take over the global aviation business at Exxon, which in and of itself seems like an impressive title. Talk to me about the size of your portfolio, what you were responsible for, the league you were playing in, and because I don't see many black people in general, playing at that level in corporate America and having that type of responsibility.
Yeah, it was a big job. It was fun. It was different from any of the other roles that I'd had. Most of my clients were the commercial airlines. Basically, my organization sold jet fuel to all of the major airlines, be they U.S. or international airlines. We also were a supplier to the U.S. military around the world, and that wasn't. And those were all done via a bidding process, and so you may have the contract today and not tomorrow if you're not competitive with your bid. So there was a need to keep the portfolio balanced, and so the stress point there was to make sure that your bids were always competitive enough where you're not going to be losing and gaining year after year. But we also had non-U.S. customers around the world as well, be they commercial airlines like Singapore Air or Qantas and others, as well as militaries that were allies to the U.S. government. But the role was more than just selling a product. We also ran airports. We also operated some joint ventures with some of our airline partners and other oil companies as well. If we were in a market where it just didn't make sense for all of us to have individual operations, how could we create an operating entity to provide services for all of the airlines, and then you share the costs and whatever the profitability may have been as a result of that. But there's also a safety operation component to where, I remember having a conversation with an airline. I won't name them, but I remember someone asked the question, "What does success look like?" And someone said, "Well, if we can get this done 99% right, then we're successful." And this particular airline executive said, 99% means we just lost 3 aircraft full of people, and so it kind of helped put in perspective the risk that came with this role. I remember walking out on the tarmac and we were training people on how to look and observe safety issues at airports. And you might have a little screw, a screw that sucked into an engine could be a big deal. I mean, even animals. So this job, while it may have appeared to some to have just been a sales role, the sales part was the least of our concerns. I mean, we were running a fairly complex business in an international space where governments wanted to get involved. In many cases, they wanted to influence your ability to price a certain way, and they didn't want you to operate in some country. So it was just a fairly complex portfolio. But I had people who were experts in a whole lot of different areas, and those people were allowed to do what they were experts at doing. And my job was to kind of oversee all of those things and figure out how to stitch it together to make for a profitable and successful business. I think it was about $100 billion business. We had 500 customers, and we were in every major country in the world. And we were in some countries that were not major. But it was complex, a lot of people, a lot of assets. I mean, $100 billion business is, in many cases, is a separate company in of itself. But I was entrusted to run a business of that size, and I didn't take that for granted. Had a lot of success, and actually so much so when it was time to move on, it was clear to me that coming back to the U.S., there wasn't going to be any job that was going to match that one. And so that's when I decided to retire, and Cheryl and I moved back to Houston.
And so before we move into your short-lived retirement phase of life, some of the funniest and always told in a humble way, but some of the funniest stories that I've heard were I think a part of that global jet fuel business, talking about Australian Airlines being held for a year, or navigating bomb squads in Colombian hotels, or watch shopping with the prince in the Middle East or something like that. Your stories have always been unbelievable to me, but it was also clear that it was something that really only a business like Exxon could afford people to experience. Talk to me about the uniqueness of that global footprint and you being in a position to build these relationships with people all over the world.
Yeah. I think you're right. The oil and gas business, especially for the multinationals, it is a very complex industry that few people will ever totally understand. You've got the upstream, you have the downstream, you have the midstream. You have people having to, some of the conditions where the product is, it's not ideal. But you have to go where the product is. The industry is continually using technology to get better and safer. And while people give them a hard time about the environmental components of the portfolio, the oil and gas industry is actually getting better and better each day at managing the impact it has on society. I was talking to someone about directional drilling, and you could kind of drill in this spot. You can go down a mile, and you can go out 5 miles. And so back in the day, to do that meant you had to drill probably 50 wells. Today you can drill one and get the same impact just because of how we use technology. The rigs that are needed to actually extract the product from the soil or on the sea, those are hundreds of millions of dollars of pieces of equipment. You lose one of those, you lost a whole lot of money. And so it's truly an industry that's complex. It takes its hits. Exxon obviously has the Valdez in its past. I mean, we took a lot of hits as a result of that. But I will tell you, I'd say we, I don't work for them anymore. They are a stronger company because of the things that were put in place to make it so post the Exxon Valdez. But I would also tell you that the industry is better because other companies saw what Exxon did and realized that they would not have survived that incident had it been them. So they started to make progressive changes as well. So it's an industry that has an impact on everything we do. I was in a lively discussion with a young lady who was anti the oil and gas companies and said, you guys just need to stop doing things. And I said, do you realize the lipstick that you have on, the wax came from the oil industry. So you're going to stop wearing lipstick. You realize the tires on your car has a petroleum base in them. You're going to start walking to work. And so if you look at it, that industry affects every facet of our lives every day. Now, should they get a pass on not protecting the environment? No, they should not. They probably don't need to get beat up as much as they do either. But hey, they're big boys and girls, so they can put up with it. But it was Troy, I have to tell you, I never thought I would work for one company for 35 years. I never thought early in my life that I would work for Exxon, now ExxonMobil, for 35 years. But I will tell you that the benefits of doing that are so obvious to me in terms of what I've been able to do with my life, as well as to prepare the next generation to be jump started and not have to start, at a lower level, just because their father and mother were able to kind of jumpstart them to be able to run at a faster pace earlier in their career than I was able to do so. So I would venture to say, at 5 and 10 years into their career, they're going to be much further than I was at that point. Partly because they're smarter than I am, but also because we were able to position them and teach them some things that I wasn't taught at an early age.
I don't know how many of those people are going to be going 10 years in the organization nowadays, but I hear you. So you make the move back from Belgium to the U.S. And you decide now is the right time. You spent 35 years and you're ready to enjoy the fruits of your labor. But that didn't last long because you are pulled out of retirement to become the president of the National Black MBA Association, a nonprofit where I met you at. Talk to me about what led to that and that next phase of probably more of your returning phase in your career.
Right. It definitely was the return phase because they could never afford to pay me what I thought that job was worth, given the amount of effort that I had to put in. But it was, I'm a lifetime member of the National Black MBA Association, and we started having conversations about some things that they wanted to do. And they wanted some volunteer help with that, and then the conversation morphed into something bigger, and so they had asked me then if I would come on for 90 days to help them out on some things, which I said fine, and 90 led to 180, and 180 led to a year, and then after a year we said, well, let's sign another kind of 6-month contract. And after that, we said, you know what, we're just kidding ourselves here. Let's just sign an agreement. Let's get the work done in whatever length of time it takes. And as it turned out, I think I was there 5 years, where you and I met kind of in the middle of that 5. The reason why, and when I retired, I had no desire, no interest in coming back to work. And but one of the reasons why I took the role with Black MBA is part of what that organization is designed to do is to help prepare students for corporate life. They have this program called LOT, Leaders of Tomorrow, where they would pour into the lives of high school students to help prepare them for life beyond high school, whether it be going on to college or becoming an entrepreneur, or whatever they plan to do. What do you need to have in your bag of tricks in terms of life survival skills? And so I was intrigued by that. They also, for undergrad and graduate students, were designed to help them match with companies and decide what jobs they might have for them, and some of the things they need to do to get prepared for those roles. And so I truly saw this as part of the return, because even though the students, I thought in most cases, were ready, not all companies were going to the places where the students were. And so this organization kind of became an organization where we would bring 10,000 people together for a conference, and you would bring anywhere from 250 to 400 companies and universities there to hire the students. And so I felt good about what the organization was doing. So I did see it as an extension of my return phase. And then it came a point where I felt I'd done what I came to do. Could have stayed longer, but just didn't feel at that point it was the right place for me to be. And so I was very comfortable, handing the baton off to someone else to kind of take the organization to the next level. I knew I had a defined mission when I was there, but I also knew the things that the organization needed to do for the next 5 to 10 years. I wasn't prepared to work that hard to make it happen. And so it was time for me to make them aware of that and help them find someone else who was willing to take it to the next step.
And how long did you ultimately stay retired the first time?
I retired in 2011, and for the first year I did nothing. I mean, I'd wake up in the morning, it's 8 o'clock, and I look at my watch again, it's 8 at night. And then Black MBA, I was there 5 years, and I retired, I think, 2 years ago, I think it was. And I'm still retired. I do a lot of entrepreneurial things nowadays. I've invested in the hospitality space, and on the hotel side and the restaurant side, just to kind of keep my brain active. But I would probably say I'm ready to retire again. Retiring is fun, but the things I'm doing now I'm doing. One reason is just to kind of keep the brain cells going, but the other is just making sure that I position some things to be able to hand off to the next generation, so they don't. Well, I don't think they're going to suffer anyway, but it just gives them a jump start on some things that maybe I didn't have an opportunity to have a jump start on.
So I want to dive into that a little bit. One thing that I gathered from your experience at Exxon was, or two things that I gathered was, one, it placed you in an ability to join a lot of boards, both nonprofit and for-profit opportunities, which just gonna tremendously expand your networking opportunities, as well as your influence on what's going on. So I do want to talk about some of the organizations you've been associated with from a board perspective, more of that return aspect of the 3 phases of life you mentioned, but then also that corporate compensation that you were able to earn has led you to delve into the entrepreneurial space, as you mentioned, in the hospitality industry, in the restaurant industry. So one, I want to talk about your board service, and then also I want to talk about the difference that you're experiencing. I think you're more of a passive investor, but you are nonetheless, still committing to some entrepreneurial experiences. I want to talk about that as well.
Okay. Uh, ExxonMobil um, paid its executives in terms of base pay and incentive pay quite competitively. And so you're right. Much of what I did with ExxonMobil actually prepared me to be able to make the investments today that we're making, even though they may be passive investments. Um, we have everything I do. Though I have a partner, and I don't think I would go out today and start many businesses where I was the sole person, because it's just not something I want to do at this stage of life. But there's no question, the 35-year career I had with ExxonMobil is largely responsible for me having the ability to do the investments that we're making now. I made some decisions investment wise early on in the stock market because of Exxon and later ExxonMobil that turned out to be pretty good decisions that also helped build this kitty to be able to do some things now. But I don't take lightly the fact that my career with ExxonMobil did position me to be able to make investments. And I actually believe that model is going to become a more of a common model where I think people are going to look at entrepreneurial opportunities. I think the younger children today, the young adults, are a lot more attuned to what the business opportunities are in terms of owning their own businesses than maybe I was early on in my career. But I think that's a model that you're going to continue to see the younger generations pursue. In terms of board opportunities, ExxonMobil did not allow its executives to participate in for-profit boards. The theory was, we pay you enough. We want you to go out and participate in not-for-profit boards because that's part of the give back, not only from a personal standpoint, but from the corporate side as well. And so, and for me, education was the thing that I felt that I wanted to spend my volunteer time around. And so, I've sat on FAMU's board. I sat on Lane College's board. I currently am sitting on Benedict College's board in South Carolina. And so I'm all in when it comes to education. And so that's why I spend, and I'm on the Dean's Advisory Council for Ohio State Business School. And I was also on the Dean's Advisory Council for FIU, which is Florida International University here in Miami. So educationally, that's where my passion has been. That's where my time has been. But that's also where my treasure has gone, because my wife and I have set endowments. We have one at Ohio State in honor of Dr. Hale, the guy we talked about earlier, who was responsible for me to go to Ohio State. We have one at Lane College in honor of my grandmother, who made it possible for me to kind of get this whole thing started. And we also have one at Spelman College, and it was a 50th birthday gift I gave to my wife. And but people oftentimes say, "Well, but she didn't go to Spelman." And that's, yeah, you're right. But Spelman is an all-girls school. My wife is the oldest of three girls, and we have three girls. So I just figured it was kind of cute to do something around the girl thing, and Spelman became the beneficiary of that. So my time and treasure truly has been in the educational space. If I wasn't trying to make money, the money that we were giving away was all in that arena, and we feel good about that.
That sounds like a wonderful gift. I'm gonna have to edit that out so my wife doesn't hear that part of the podcast. One more thing I wanted to touch on is I've noticed you are a part of a lot of organizations social organizations, networking organizations, and that's one thing that from an individual standpoint I do well, I network well, but from an organizational standpoint I really haven't been a part of a lot of these types of organizations. But I've noticed that they've had a significant role in your life and career. Talk to me about the importance of being of networking in general, but then also how these larger organizations have been able to facilitate that.
Hmm. Well, I oftentimes say you either network or you may not work for long, and so networking is important. Um, Social networking is okay, but I tend to believe that my networking was more with a purpose that was bigger than just a social network. I'm a member of two fraternities, and we spend a lot of time together. But it's not just social time. Much of what we're doing it's akin to what I'm doing on my own. We do a lot of mentoring for boys. We also do a lot of seminars around investment opportunities. In fact, one of the fraternities I'm in actually has a board preparedness workshop for those who want to pursue corporate board opportunities. So I do believe, and for me, one of the reasons why I pursued the organizations that I did is what they do is consistent with some of the things that I was trying to do on my own. And sometimes you can get a whole lot more done as part of a group than you can individually. And so, while I enjoy the fellowship with the fraternities, I enjoy more the business aspect of what they're trying to do, because it helped me to be able to do more faster by being part of a network versus trying to do it on my own. And I won't give a shout out to who those fraternities are, other than one is colors of black and gold. And I'll let you all figure that one out.
Yeah, that's one thing I definitely think that I need to. I'm always, you know, one, I'm interested in these podcasts for the intellectual curiosity aspect, but also, how can I bring pieces of information in to improve what I'm working on, and that's one of the things I think I need to elevate my game in. So before we go, and you've dropped numerous bits of wisdom and whatnot, what would you want to leave with the listeners as the ultimate give them the business advice?
I think there are a few things. I think one is, as we pursue our careers, regardless of what it is, we have to always be a critical thinker and a superior decision maker. People who get the attention of senior folks are people who have proven that they can think critically in situations and make decisions even without all the data they may need. And so as we're trying to pursue whatever it is, I think just being a critical thinker is part of what you have to have in your bag of tricks to be successful. I think the other is to understand the value of a moment, because you may only have a moment, and oftentimes, when that moment is gone, it doesn't repeat itself. So we need to be able to understand when that moment is there, and how we need to be able to kind of seize it. Most of us are going to be successful, and sometimes success breeds arrogance, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And so we need to be able to manage our success as we grow and develop, and have standards for ourselves that don't change because we move up the ladder. And so that, I think, oftentimes can be a watch out. It needs to be a watch out for us, because sometimes our attitudes get in the way of progress that we would have if we just had managed it a little bit better. I think the other thing too is we don't talk nearly enough in the corporate world or to young Black brothers and sisters about ethics. Um, you know, achieving results are important. How we achieve those results are probably more important, um, because sometimes success breeds arrogance. Sometimes success breeds. Um, I've done that. I can, I don't want a setback, so I'm going to cut a corner here because I don't have time to do it the right way. And oftentimes when that happens, it just becomes a slippery slope. You cut a corner one time and it worked out, so you figure I can do it again. But how we achieve results are as important as the results are themselves. And so we need to be very careful about not staying true to who we are, because if you lose your moral compass, it's hard to find your way back to reality. And that happens a lot with successful people, because they're driven. Sometimes we live on the edge, and we're always trying to find that next it. And in looking for that next it, oftentimes we do the wrong thing. And we think we're doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, but at the end of the day, there is no right reason for not maintaining high ethical standards. And the last thing I'll say is and especially true for young Black men and women, we need to protect our brand. If you go to any corporation, they will protect their brand like there's no tomorrow. You violate their brand standards, your lawyer will get a call probably that same day. As individuals, we also have a brand, and is he a critical thinker? That becomes part of your brand if you are. So whatever that is that people define you as, especially if it's good, you need to maintain that. Because your brand speaks to who you are and will determine what roles you might have an opportunity to be offered in the future. So we need to protect it the same as any corporation will. And the last thing I'll say is, and again, this is more to the young folk than the more senior folk, and that is manage your social media, the use of social media. A lot of careers have never gotten started because someone had an inappropriate post on social media. It's easy to get out there. It's probably easy to get carried away when you're out there in that space. But once you put it out there, it's there forever. And companies do look to the young folk who are getting ready to go interview for jobs. Don't think they don't look at your page. They do. And so don't destroy a great, promising career before it gets started just because you put something out there that was inappropriate.
Well, Jesse, you mentioned recognizing and valuing the moment. I definitely recognize and value this moment and appreciate you joining the Give 'em the Business podcast. It has been a pleasure talking to you today. Let's make sure that we continue to stay in touch and continue to pass that wisdom on to the listeners and the next generation.
Well, again, thank you, Troy. Not just for the conversation today, but thank you for what you are doing, because as you share what you're doing with others, hopefully it'll end up a blessing for a lot of other young folk who are trying to get their career started.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Jesse.
You're welcome. Thank you.